Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Casey Stewart, and I am one of the co-chairs of Penn Law's Criminal Record Expungement Project, along with Noah Schoenholz. The Criminal Record Expungement Project is a student-run pro bono project that helps people from Philadelphia navigate the expungement and pardon processes. On behalf of CREP's board, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's panel, Reverberations, a conversation on pardons, expungements, overpolicing, and race. I'm also excited to welcome DeRay McKesson, Secretary Brandon Flood, and Akeem Sims, our panelists, as well as our moderator, Taylor Pacheco. If you're seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE codes will be announced twice during the event. Please write down these codes and be sure to enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your confirmation email. If you did not receive the email, please find the link to the evaluation form in the chat. These codes will tell us how long you attended. And with that, I will turn this event over to our moderator.
Thank you, Casey. I appreciate that. And good afternoon, everyone. I echo Casey in just thanking you for joining us on this snowy afternoon. It's kind of nice that we are all safe and warm in our homes, I hope, and that nobody is out driving in this. For those of you seeking CLE credit today, as Casey said, our first keyword is incarceration. In the chat, you'll see just drop at Casey is the link there that you'll need. And logistics aside, let's get started. So we're here today to talk about a few things that intersect with each other. Specifically, we have a group of very esteemed panelists to discuss the role that pardons and expungements play in the criminal justice system, how overcriminalization affects communities of color, and the barriers to full citizenship faced by people who are dealing with those records, living with those records. The impact of the criminal justice system on communities of color is something that is known today. It's an issue. We are aware of it. We haven't fixed it, but we know it's happening. In this moment in time, especially the year that we've seen our country have a reckoning to a lot of truths that many of us have known for a long time. Our esteemed guests today are three people who have demonstrated experience working in and around these issues and more for years, and are here with us today to provide some illumination, not only to the difficulty of life with criminal records, the difficulties faced by a lot of people of color in this country, but also the hope that exists in the options available to people living with this struggle. I'd like to just take a moment and ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and if you will, share one thing that you hope our audience walks away from this panel knowing, having learned, absorbing, and putting into practice. Mr. McKesson, if I could start with you.
Amateur hour, I'm on mute. Here we go. I feel like we live on Zoom and I still couldn't figure out mute.
I'm great.
Honored to be here. Excited to talk about policing. I am one of the co-founders of Campaign Zero. Spend most of my time on issues of policing and mass incarceration by proxy.
Thanks very much. Secretary Flood, if I could ask you to introduce yourself next.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Brandon Flood. I serve as Secretary of the Pennsylvania Board of Pardons. I was appointed to this post April 1st of 2019 by our 34th Lieutenant Governor, John Fetterman. And I think one noteworthy thing to mention is for anyone in the audience that may not know, is I also was the previous recipient of a pardon myself, March of 2019. So certainly pardons do work, and we'll delve more into that a little bit later.
Wonderful, thank you, Secretary. And Mr. Sims.
Good afternoon, my name is Akeem Sims. I'm a West Philly resident, a member of the Pulse, Philadelphia Lawyers for Social Equity Pardon Project Steering Committee. I'm also the J. Gordon Cooney Fellow, which was a award through the United Way to support individuals as they're navigating the pardon process, giving them one-on-one consultation and advocacy around pardons. One thing I would want people to walk away from the panel with, the discussion, is for there be a interest. We have Public Interest Week, an interest and a level of awareness around pardons and the impact that they can have on an individual's life.
That's a great point. Akeem, I'm going to stick with you since you just brought up a great point. You are at this point on the cusp of being granted a pardon. Can you talk to us a bit about your experience in the process? What have you had to do to get this far? What factors have helped you advance, and what things have been tough about this process?
So the process, thank you, Taylor. The process began for me in 2015 after being extremely frustrated with exhausting my efforts to find employment, even to being made a conditional offer by Walmart, but to only have it rescinded after the fact of them finding out about my conviction, which I did inform them about prior to, in my application process, I informed them about that. So that's where it started, Taylor. I didn't have any idea as to what a pardon was. I actually found out about it. My younger sister sent me a Wikipedia about a pardon and what the process was. So I began to read it, and it seemed very daunting to me. I was like, I didn't know anybody who heard of it, had one, or knew about the process. So I really didn't know where to start. I went to Community Legal Services in Montgomery County because at the time I was a Norristown resident. They were very supportive in supporting me. At that time, they've made a lot of changes since then, but at that time I actually had to pay for the application to submit my pardon and then have to wait for it to be mailed. It's now available online and it's free. So that's where it was, again, started at for me. In the midst of that, my grandmother passed in 2017, which was very discouraging, to say the least, in the pardon process. But Erica Bryant, who was the attorney from CLS, was very supportive and encouraging, saying that, Akeem, you have come too far to just let it fall to the wayside. But at the time, I was like, I don't see what use I could have with having a pardon. Again, with not knowing, there's a level of uncertainty whether I'll actually get it, because I had didn't know anyone who had attained one, nor was I certain that I could get one.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where it was, Taylor. The process as it is currently, I did receive a unanimous vote in September of 2020 from the Board of Pardons to be granted a pardon. And now the status is I'm waiting on the governor to sign off on it. So I feel like I'm that much closer, but still so far away. During the process, Penn Law students actually were supportive of me in submitting my application. So it feels like an ode to Penn Law to be back on this panel discussion.
That's fantastic, Akeem, and congratulations again on being so close, and you are so close. That's wonderful. Secretary Flood, I'm going to pivot to you just because a few of the changes Akeem just mentioned in the process, the fact that he had to pay for the application, the fact that he had to wait for it to be mailed. I know you've been no small part in getting a lot of those changes pushed through, and you are also a pardon recipient, and I'm sure have your own share on how that process used to function and how it functions today. Could you speak a little bit to, the impetus for these changes and what made you so passionate about pushing them through?
Sure. First and foremost, Akeem, you're going to be good, man. You're close as you need.
Absolutely.
You're good. They can take my pardon back away if you don't get yours. But
no. Enough to go around.
But to answer your question, yeah, I mean, I'll speak through from the perspective of a former applicant, much like Akeem stated. Same deal for me. I did not know anyone personally that ever received one. I was familiar because at the time I worked for the House of Representatives, and in my research work, I came across the executive clemency process. So I knew how it worked from an administrative standpoint or from a policy standpoint. But in terms of actual practice, I didn't know anyone. I had the benefit of being in Harrisburg and being so proactive that I have reached out to my two previous predecessors, Steve Burke, who served as secretary, and Mavis Nemo, who was also secretary. So they were helpful because I brought a lot of my questions to them directly. In terms of the changes, as Akeem mentioned, one of the big changes that we made was removing the fee associated with it. And for a lot of people, it used to be in total about $63 if you did it yourself. But if you outsource that service to an attorney, and no shade to the attorneys here and the aspiring attorneys, that would be marked up to $5,000 to $7,500 easily. So, that became an access issue, and that was something that the Lieutenant Governor wanted us to address. And even for the $63, as Akeem mentioned, this is not a quick process. So a lot of folks were second guessing whether to shell out that $63 for something that didn't provide immediate relief, and then more importantly, did not guarantee a favorable outcome. So we wanted to remove as many barriers as possible. So that was the first thing we did. We removed the fee. The other thing is that beyond just removing the fee, navigating the process is another issue, and Akeem mentioned as well too. If finances wasn't an issue, it was just navigating the process and being able to digest what all the process entails, what is required from you as the applicant. And then furthermore, we used to make applicants jump through a lot of hoops and have to obtain a lot of documents on their own that wasn't necessarily easy to access. So we're in a digital age. We should be embracing technology. So a lot of things that we used to previously request from applicants, we can access ourselves, at the click of a mouse or two. So the other thing we did was we overhauled the application. And the instructions. We wanted to make it so easy, like the Geico commercial, the old tagline, so easy a caveman or a cavewoman can do it. We wanted the average layperson, the non-lawyer, to be able to understand the document and be able to fill it out. The other thing we did too is our website, and as Akeem probably can remember too, our website used to be just full of text, and even for me, as a former applicant, I found it to be quite daunting. So we revamped our website, made it very user-friendly, very resource-driven. We actually have a tutorial on our website that literally walks you through each section of the application. So for us, it more importantly was about access for us, and removing the fee, changing the application, making it more simplified, and providing those tutorials certainly have helped tremendously.
Well, as someone who has seen these changes coming into play, they're tremendous. So kudos to you and the board. Fantastic job. Mr. McKesson, I want to pivot to you. We're speaking a lot about, pardons and collateral consequences of criminal records. For you, a lot of your work focuses on limiting police interactions and stopping those events before they even start. For a lot of people, we know that they're not able to avoid that contact, and they do end up with criminal records. How do these kinds of long-term effects and feedback you get from the people you work with inform your policy work, your work with Campaign Zero, and other projects?
Yeah, I think that's sort of the thing, right? Pushing on the premise is that we'd say, a lot of people could avoid these contacts, that the police actually create so many of the circumstances that lead people to have these lifelong consequences. And what would it look like to think about accountability in the absence of cages, right? That I can think about a host of things that we could put in place to hold people accountable that don't lead to permanent records, that don't lead to them being shipped off to somewhere else, right? So how do we start to normalize this idea that the only way to think about accountability is not punitive? And we think about the difference between punishment and consequence, right? A consequence is about change. It's about setting you up so that behavior changes. A punishment is about making sure that you experience pain. And so much of the system we built is rooted in punishment. So when I think about our work, we sort of do more of the front end work. We're doing some, the pardon process is after people have already been screwed by the system, which is incredibly important too, because we've screwed so many people. But it's how do we actually just stop that from happening in the first place? And you think about places like Pennsylvania, where the felony death limit is low. The highest in the United States is 2,500, but you shouldn't go to prison for stealing a laptop. That just isn't good policy, right? That's not in the interest of public safety. So how do we start to think about this in a way that doesn't even put people in the pipeline in the first place?
Right. Reimagining the system in such a way that our work is obsolete. That's the dream. That would be the goal, that this work becomes entirely unnecessary. We're crawling there. We're not there yet, but we're crawling there.
I do think, I will just say, I think what is powerful about what Akeem said and Secretary Flood, is that so much of the way people get screwed after they have been incarcerated or have a record is like the process is just bad. You know what I mean? It's like we make it like it's like the pardon idea is a good idea, but then the process is like, even people who work in it sometimes can't navigate it. It's like, how would somebody who has no clue about, like, how would they navigate it, right? And you find that with everything from like the vaccine stuff today, right? So it's like, my grandmother is not sitting on the computer all day pressing refresh. She don't even know how to do that. You know what I mean? Like, that's not even like a thing. And I think that so much of the criminal justice system, even the parts that we designed to help people who have been negatively impacted, it's like the process is either just not designed well or designed to be hard.
I think there's a question there, right? Is it not designed well, or is it designed to be hard? I think you could hear different answers from different folks, but there's certainly a question of, if the sentence is the punishment, what is the purpose of the punitive, never-ending consequences that are then following folks? If people have served their sentence, if people have repaid their debt to society, so to speak, let's let them move on. And I think you all touched on that really nicely and really succinctly. Along that line, we are a panel of all Black people, which I love to see. This is great. I think there's a question, of course, of why does our criminal justice system look the way it does? Why is it populated by the folks that it's populated by? And again, million answers, million different factors. But I'd love to hear each of you just kind of share, one, how does this impact the way that we treat people who have criminal records, in your view? And two, does this play into how easy it is to get free of those records? DeRay, I'll start with you since we're already speaking.
Yeah, I think that, so the follow-up that I'll say to the last question is, I think that we're in this moment where there are so many sort of good people in the system, right? So we get like a Secretary Flood who was impacted and now has structural power. We get the people in Congress who get it. We get these legislators. And I think that what you find is that sometimes you get the well-meaning people, especially in the legislature, who literally just don't know. They don't know. They would vote a certain way. They'd introduce the bill, but they literally don't know, So like, so much of, I feel like the advocate space is like helping people understand like what is what, how do we undo it? Like, and there's not as much friction as I thought there'd be. I think the second thing about like the how do we get here, I think the war on drugs was a big part of just like allowing people to build an infrastructure that would live far beyond drugs. I think the second thing that I've learned, over the past 6 years is just how like not deep the legislative process is. Like some things that become laws, you're like, well, this wasn't like some amazing study or some great thought. So like most states pay people who are incarcerated to be like, they pay people they charge people room and board, or you have to pay for medical visits, stuff like that. Like literally the room and board charges in America legit came from a legislator in Michigan who read an article in Reader's Digest a gazillion years ago that made the argument. He introduces a bill and now it's everywhere. You're like, that is how the system gets made, Like, and as a kid, I'm like, wow, this must have been a 10-year study that showed that. And now it's like, this guy's reading some stuff in Reader's Digest. Like that is sort of nuts.
Yeah, that's a great point, that we attribute a lot more significance to these laws than perhaps we should, right? Like we trust our legislators, we trust our lawmakers, and we should. But we should also question, right? We should be aware of these processes that are creating these laws that structure and shape our lives. Secretary Flood, could you speak a bit to the question I posed of, the racial lines that we see along criminal justice communities, and in your experience, and of course, I'm not asking you for specific numbers, the breakdown and the reflection of these populations of people coming before the board and seeking to get free of these records?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the previous speaker said about structural power, right, and infrastructure, it comes down to that. And I know for me, when I first made my foray into state government, and I was very intentional at getting as deep into government as possible under the radar, so that I could be in these positions, and there was some, behind while I'm in the forefront now to get a lot of press, there were a lot of positions that I had that I had a lot of structural power behind the scenes, especially working for legislators. Anyone that has worked with a legislator knows that the staffers are the engine, and the legislators in many cases are certainly just the figurehead, so to speak. So it definitely comes down to structural power. You know, we oftentimes use well, you hear quite a bit, the phrase white privilege, right? And that's a real and existing dynamic. But Black privilege is also a real and existing dynamic as well too. So if you have more Black and brown judges, more Black and brown prosecutors, more Black and brown agency heads, you would see a difference in outcomes. And it comes down to having the privilege. When we talk about white privilege, it's just having the privilege to go before someone who looks like you, who can identify with you, and who can identify with you culturally. So, you know, same thing when it comes to, you know, in my position, a lot of folks that come to me that I can relate to. I was them. Literally, I was them, you know, so you do become more sympathetic. You do look for ways, workarounds, and try to grant a reprieve whenever you can. So in terms of racial breakdown, yeah, you know, we commissioned the study. I'm a big data guy, and certainly for the Board of Pardons, you know, I've been a big cheerleader, and I'll continue to be a big cheerleader that we need more funding. You know, we've been able to do some great things, but we've been able to do some great things on a shoestring budget. So I think we'll harken back to the comment that was made earlier about whether systems are designed to fail, right? You know, so you know, I use this as an opportunity to collect that data and share that data with the legislature, particularly our Black and brown legislators. We have a ton of the vast majority of folks that apply for, at least now that we've simplified the process, we've seen it change where you have more Black and brown folks applying. Whereas before, when it was a very arcane process, you know, you had more white folks availing themselves of this process because for a number of reasons, but whether educationally or whether they just had access to attorneys and funding, they had the wherewithal to hire an attorney to navigate this process. And we know, so we commissioned a study where we broke down the race of those that apply and those that have received or the recipients of pardons, and it disproportionately shows that more white men in particular are the recipients of pardons because of that access. So, you know, so part of what we can do, you know, in the meantime is making sure that we level that playing field, that we open that access up. But yeah, it comes down to the structural powers that be. Whereas before, when I worked outside of the Board of Pardons and just knew how things worked from a policy standpoint, I thought everything, literally when I worked for the legislature, I thought every change that needed to be made with the Board of Pardons had to be done legislatively. It was only until when I got there and was probably about 2 months in and got myself settled in, there are tons of things that we can do administratively that we don't need that legislative action, but you need someone to have that not only the vision, but also the chutzpah to undertake that. So that's my take on things.
So I love that point, Secretary Flood. That's a fantastic point that we always default, and I'm a lawyer. I know I'm guilty of this, of legislation. There are so many faster, more effective ways to do things. Administration, bureaucracy, getting to someone who, you know, like you said, has the chutzpah. I know I'm saying that wrong. Somebody who has that push and can do it and is willing to do it. You don't always need to work it through the House and the Senate. And sometimes you can impact so many people so quickly. Love that point.
The other one of the most difficult parts of my job is there's some things I can do unilaterally, and then there's some things that I have to get board approval for. One of my toughest parts of my job is getting that approval from the board, because you have no one likes change, right? Especially change coming in such a rapid succession as has happened since January of 2019. So old habits die hard, and and getting our board members to say, hey, listen, we get that there are times when we should yield to the legislature or we should yield to the Constitution, but you guys are board members for a reason. Chart your own path, be trailblazers in your own right. So just wanted to add that piece.
Love it. On that topic, Akeem, you have a lot of great experience with community organizing and getting the word out about pardons, using your own experience about, you didn't know what it was. You 6 years ago, you had no idea what a pardon was, and you were kind of led to it, and you would like to make that process easier for other people. Along that vein, do you think that pardons are being taken fully advantage of by Black and Brown communities? And I know your experience is specific to Philly, but generalizing that as much as you can, do you think that the knowledge about pardons exists in the community?
That's a great question, Taylor. And I'll start with this. Outside of Lil Wayne or Kodak Black getting a pardon from Donald Trump, I don't know of any or that many other people who know of someone that they can relate to that received a pardon. It wasn't until I got involved in some community organizing work and seen a sister who applied on her own and obtained a pardon that I felt that much more confident that I could do it. So it was that sense of it, since someone else I knew had that attainment, accomplishment, I felt that much better in doing it. But as far as it being taken advantage of, no, Taylor, because people don't know about it. They know about expungement, but don't even know the full extent of what an expungement can do or can't do. And then, like I said, with that time length on a pardon, not having that immediacy, like people need something in the immediate to get them by. It's an economic thing. That's where it was for me, both education-wise as well. I was denied funding because of my drug felony conviction. So I was denied opportunities for employment. I'm an aspiring accounting professional. And the number one in alphabetical order profession that you need a license for, you are denied for an accountant. You can't have a conviction and be an accountant. So that's part of my reason for pursuing the pardon. But tell her, no, people don't have that association, the network, the funding, any resources, but just don't believe that it's something that they can achieve. They don't believe. So I think it's big for Secretary Flood, people like myself, and anyone else who does have a pardon to be that much more of an advocate for people to, one, know that it's obtainable, accessible, right? And that, if you have some affiliations or associations that can put you in a better position, utilize those as well. Utilize those as well, but definitely not being taken advantage of in our community. And that's why, yes, I'm big on advocating for. I told people it becomes so much a part of my life that I can't shut up about it. Not just because of the achievement, but who I've become in the process, the people I've been able to meet, the networks I've had, the inner reflection that I've been able to achieve in the process. But so it's a lot, Taylor. No, people definitely do not have in our communities faith in the pardon process or feel like it's something that they will benefit from.
That was beautifully put, Akeem. Thank you. I think that is a huge issue, and it's just something we're going to have to keep working around. I was going to move on, but DeRay, were you going to interject there?
Oh no, I was trying not to cough on the mic. Trying to get to my mute button while I cough.
Sorry for putting you on blast then. Sliding onto a slightly related topic, something that has become a bit of a buzzword over the past year is the word abolition. This idea that, these systems are bearing down on communities of color, on not just communities of color, but low-income communities, people who are caught up in systems they can't escape, can't move past, can't get better jobs, can't go back to school, can't get loans for starting small businesses. And the idea being that, police reform is the answer to this. DeRay, could you speak just generally on how you think police reform answers this question of abolition, as opposed to, undoing the criminal justice system's effects from this angle, from the aspect of pardons and expungements and helping people who have gone through a system get free that after they've already had that contact?
Yeah, I think that, so when I think about abolition, I'm always reminded that abolition is one of the only things that this country did right? Like the end of enslavement, we know it is possible. That is a system that people said would endure. That was a system that people said was like the bedrock of blah, blah, blah. And like we were able to undo it in that way. So I always remind people that like abolition is not some far-fetched idea. You already know it. People always think it's impossible. I also know that there's often a path to abolition, that abolition doesn't come because we just repeat the word, that there's actually like a plan and a path to get there. And the whole goal is to make sure that people never have to experience the bad in the first place, right? Like justice is actually not helping people afterwards. That is some sort of thing about accountability. That is making people whole. Justice is the idea that like people don't experience the bad in the first place. So I do think that it's a part of like, how do we, in mass incarceration in the sense of like, we're just not incarcerating people. Things aren't crimes. People aren't in cages is a part, like that is like the thrust. I think the police are a big part of it. I spend most of my time on policing. And the hard part about the police conversation is that most people think about it in terms of use of force, right? Like that's how people think about it. But we always think about it in terms of the whole pie, that like you can't name 3 ways that you get to prison or jail that don't include a police officer. The police are the gateway to mass incarceration. So there's no way to do the larger work without actually doing the police work at the front end.
Close the gate and you cut off a lot of the problem, basically. Great point. Secretary Flood, could you speak a little to the idea that, pardon work is abolition work?
Yeah, absolutely. But as DeRay said, I make it my point, especially to speak to local officials, but also our state officials about, even when it comes to the subject of marijuana, right, decriminalizing, right, to the extent that those cases they shouldn't have to come before us to begin with. And certainly folks shouldn't have to go through such a rigorous process for such a venial offense. So yeah, for us, I had a phone call this morning with a Republican legislator named Rich Irvin. And I usually use the opportunity especially when I have Republican legislators contact me about constituents that have pardons. And usually they contact me to get a status update or to kind of in an indirect way, see if they can speed up the process. And I use that as an invitation for me to say, hey, we can't do that, but let's sit down and I'll tell you exactly how we can speed this process up. What kind of investment is needed to ensure that not only the constituent you contacted me for, but the other 60,000 plus constituents you have that may have to go through the same process, you can make it easier for them. And to Akeem's point, not only the general public is largely not knowledgeable about executive clemency, our policymakers aren't either. Oftentimes we get conflated with probation and parole. That's why I wanted to immediately started participating in budget hearings every year, because I wanted them to put a face to who we are. I want them to understand that it's just not Philadelphians that benefit from this. It's just not Pittsburghians that benefit from this, but folks in Lawrence County and King County and a lot of these rural areas. And oftentimes when I have that opportunity and I make that pitch to them, that they oftentimes agree. And in the course of that, I'm able to create an ally, especially on Republicans or control chambers of the General Assembly. So yeah, it's definitely abolition work, as you heard Akeem mention earlier too. For me, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life professionally until I was probably about 26, 27, where I knew without a shadow of a doubt I wanted to work in government, I wanted to work in politics. But at that time, I had already incurred 2 felony convictions and juvenile adjudication. So, oftentimes people, when they have that aha moment and they know what they're passionate about, and they not only know what they're passionate about, but find their passion and can monetize their passion, they're oftentimes locked out from pursuing that because of those criminal convictions. So, for us, to the extent that we can enable people to pursue their passions and make careers from that and take care of their families, and more importantly, prevent them from recidivating. As I mentioned to the Representative Irvin earlier, most people that go through this, most people that recidivate, at least that I know, don't recidivate because they just don't want to move on with a lot of reproductive members of society. They oftentimes have a series of experiences, negative experiences, where trying to do the right thing doesn't yield the outcomes. And we're big on telling people, if you work hard, success will be the fruit that's born. But for a lot of people, that's not the reality for a lot of people. So, Keem mentioned it earlier. So last year, historically, we never had more than 600 people apply per year, historically, and we've been around since 1872. We finished 2020, calendar year 2020, with more than 2,100 applications. And in my opinion, well, that's great. There should be 10,000 people, deserving people applying. But if they were, we wouldn't have the capacity, and wait times will be 10 years, for that. So, there's tons of people, to Akeem's point, that should be applying who just either don't or just are otherwise reluctant to do so. So this is very much abolition work. And, for me, this was, in full disclosure, me being appointed to this position kind of interrupted my plans. I wanted my pardon for a reason. I didn't want it I didn't want to oversee the Board of Pardons. I wanted it for a reason. I did have my eye on elected office. But the fact that this opportunity was extended to me, this was something that, and excuse my French, fuck what my personal agenda was. This was something that could help tons of other folks, and we may not have that opportunity where you have a formally convicted person be able to oversee a criminal justice agency. So, that was something. So I consider it abolition work. And I also pride myself on accessibility, being responsive. So, I don't plan on staying in this position for 20 years. So I'm gonna keep the foot on the accelerator for the duration that I'm here. And for that very reason that I feel like this is abolition work.
Well, I know myself and a lot of people are really glad you did take a little break from your plans, but we'll be watching to see where they go. Akeem, I'm going to circle back. This is a question for both Akeem and you as well, Secretary. You talked to Akeem about how long the pardon process took, how when you kind of reached that point 2 years in when your grandmother passed, where you were just like, screw this, I don't have time for this, I need to move on. We're at a point now where, like you said, Secretary, pardon applications are increasing, and hopefully, Lord willing, they keep increasing to the point that the board has to keep increasing to keep pace. I know as of today, there's a push, there's a drive to get Governor Wolf to address a backlog of applications that are on his desk. How does that, impact the way that you go about recruiting people to apply for pardons? How does that impact Secretary Flood, the way that you do your work? Can you each speak to that a bit? Akeem, I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Taylor. I don't know that I have an immediate response to the part about recruiting people. It's just more so just advising them that it is still attainable. I don't have, or they won't have any control over what the governor does. Hopefully, we can push for the governor like our, steering committee did with sending a letter and starting a petition for him to sign on some pardons that are on his desk. But it doesn't stop that advocacy part, just informing people, one, what the process is, two, that, it is attainable. And hopefully with that, there'll be an increase in the applications because we've seen that the number is getting the application submitted. People aren't applying. That's just the simple fact of it. People just aren't applying for pardons. And for me, like I said, the reason is they don't know about it, are confused about what the process is, and then don't know anybody who has attained one. So I would say continue, push people through, advise them that now is the time. The current administration, as far as the Board of Pardons that's in there, to me, is favorable for pardons. And as the numbers say it, Taylor, that the governor signs off on 90% or maybe more of those that the Board of Pardons gives their support for, but it's just that time, the time matters. So maybe it is a policy thing, as I think DeRay was mentioning, and impacting policy, advocating the impact, some type of policy around the governor should have some type of guideline or restriction on 3 to 6 months, whatever it is, that you have to have pardons that are on your desk out. I think just recently a man passed from COVID while in prison, waiting on a commutation that's on the governor's desk. So there's a lot of things that are going into it, and hopefully at some point, Taylor, the governor, I think the current administration with the Board of Pardons is favorable, but I don't know about with the governor, and it may be something political wise. I don't know.
And the thing too is, I remember, what Akeem's talking about, especially with the time frame. Remember, most of these laws were written like before computer. When like Speedy was like the horse taking the thing, you know what I mean? Like we just in a different time. So part of it is also like we need to intentionally like update the way that we put prosecute. I think about things like felony theft, like how much do you steal to make it a felony? No state ties it to inflation. Most of these amounts were set 10,000 years ago. You know, in New Jersey, the amount was set in 1978. If you steal over $200 in New Jersey, that's considered a felony. You're like, I'm sure in 1978, $200 was way more than it is right now. But like
Today, it's a Snickers bar.
that is nuts. You know, like the number 200, that's like a Nintendo Switch. You know, like there's not a world where that makes sense. And I do worry that like, you know, so much of the criminal justice stuff is this is not just criminal justice. This is like all the social justice stuff. Sometimes it becomes like what's the coolest or best story. It is not always like what's the most impactful or what we can do right now or like what's like the easy piece of the cake that we could just, you know, like, so, you know, drugs is a great example. The space is sort of like, it's a lot of work around drugs and mass incarceration. And like most people in the space know that like the end of the drug war will not end mass incarceration. It will help. It will do good. It is important. It is necessary. Won't end it, right? We're going to have to do something about property crimes, public disorder, and violence. Like we got to. And like, we got to start shifting there too. You know, we can't just like sit in the drug space for another decade. We just won't win that way, you know?
That's a great point. It also ties into a question we just had come through the chat. This person's asking about this notion, Secretary Flood, of a term you used of deserving people, you know, people who deserve a pardon. And DeRay, you're touching on, you know, drugs. We always hear about drugs, right? When we hear about mass incarceration, we hear about people being sentenced for things that are completely disproportionate to their crime. But there are a lot of crimes, like you just mentioned. Secretary Flood, could you speak a little answering this question, which reads, is there a consistent application of a definition of that concept? What are reasons that someone might be a bad candidate for a pardon or someone who the board is leery of in this process?
That's a great question. And, you know, I want to step back to the question you posed to Akeem. You know, the easy answer for me for any question about why we aren't doing more or why the process isn't faster is just for me to say, well, I don't have the money or I don't have the personnel. That's the easy answer to give. So while I'm waiting, you know, certainly I'm working to get more funding and certainly leveraging the relationships I have with the General Assembly. We need to do something in the meantime, right? You know, I can't just wait for that. So we have to be innovative and look at doing things differently. And DeRay mentioned a point about how a lot of times, and you heard me talk about our board, or they're accustomed to doing things that we've done since the 19th century, right? You know, we looked at all, and this ties into the person who just posed this question. We treated all applicants the same. You know, the person who was convicted of first-degree murder 10 years ago is treated the same way as the person who stole a sandwich from Wawa 30 years ago, and vice versa. And, you know, so what we're trying to do is be more innovative internally and have these expedited lanes and these different levels of review based upon the severity of the offense. We talk about, especially when we talk about drug crimes, and we talk about nonviolent offenses. When it comes to the governor and when an application is recommended to the governor, a nonviolent application, you shouldn't need the same exhaustive review that you would for someone who's serving life, whose sentence you're looking to commute. You know, to be perfectly honest, you know, especially after depending upon the vote threshold, if someone gets, like Akeem mentioned, you got a nonviolent applicant who got a unanimous vote from the board, there's not much review that's needed. Those can kind of be automatically, stamped off on, or at least a lesser degree of review. So that's something that we're working with, or we're attempting to work with the governor's office to say, hey, listen, there needs to be a different level of review based upon the kind of applications that we're recommending to you. No one knocks you for taking an exhaustive review of someone was previously convicted of life. But some of these low-level offenses, especially ones that occurred decades ago, it's absolutely unconscionable. So to the point about what things the board can, and then the other part too, I should mention too, I'll make a plug here. We're also going to be transitioning to an online platform to be able to submit applications. Our rollout date is projected for December of this year. December or at least January of next year. So that will, at least in theory, be able to assist with the efficiency, and those turnaround times should be lessened. To the question about what things that the board looks at, the first thing that the board looks at is the nature of the offense. The next thing that they look at is how long ago the offense occurred. So how much time has elapsed since then. We don't have a hard and fast rule that you must be crime free after X amount of years, but certainly the more time that elapses, the better. The other thing that the board looks at is what you've been doing in between. Let me back up. If you were ever on court order supervision, probation or parole, how your adjustment was with probation and parole, because we do consult probation and parole about your time spent on under supervision. The other thing that they look at is just generally, what have you been doing with your time? What are you doing professionally? What have you done to improve yourself personally? The other part that a lot of people may not place much stock on, but our board does, is who's supporting you in your community. Obviously family, by default, usually is supportive. So they're looking for folks outside of family and friends. Of course, families and friends are going to say Brandon's the best thing since sliced bread, right? But they're looking for objective parties, whether that's community leaders, whether that's faith-based leaders, whether that's public officials, essentially anyone who's willing to put their neck on the line for you. And then lastly, I think the question the board looks at is why are you requesting this relief? So for some people, I think Akeem mentioned it's an economic reason, my job prospects, or I have tons of people, especially women. I think DeRay mentioned about retail theft. A lot of women are looking to enter the medical field, and they're going to school, they're obtaining these credentials, and only to be told that they're unable to pursue those career paths. So those are the things that the board looks at in the totality, and they also look at the narrative too from the person, responsibility, insight. So believe it or not, they do look at those narratives, and it is indicative of whether someone admitted fault or is insightful about why they did what they did, especially if substance abuse was a primary driver of those criminal convictions. So those are a few of the factors that the board considered.
Thank you for that, Secretary. Appreciate it. I think that was a really illustrative segue as well into the different areas that criminal records impact that a lot of people don't necessarily think about. We know jobs, right? We know people get these background checks for jobs. We don't think about licensing boards, like you mentioned, a lot of people applying to be nurses, and that holds you back. Suppose you were already a nurse and you obtain a criminal record. Well, guess what? You're not anymore. So these are a lot of things that the pardon board has the power to impact. Go ahead, Secretary.
I just want to add one other thing too. So the other thing that we're looking at, and this is kind of in line with us creating these expedited lanes, is so I'll be having a meeting with the Pennsylvania District Attorneys Association, I believe this week, or no, matter of fact, next week. So essentially what I want to do, because we district attorneys are involved in this process, they are solicited to provide input. But I think who better a champion of an applicant to say, hey, this person's application should be expedited than the DA in the county where that person was convicted of. So essentially what I'm looking to do is to partner with the DA's Association and create some kind of mechanism to where the DAs can request that someone and be able to articulate the reasons why someone's application should be expedited. And if they provide that to us, we will provide a lesser degree of review and essentially be able to get those cases in front of the board in a significantly quicker time than with our traditional cases. And this would be something that the DA certainly they can opt into, but I think it would carry more weight than coming from me being, my subjective criteria for what we should be expediting if we have the DAs themselves weighing in on this. So that conversation or that meeting is about to be had, but we are looking at ways outside of just building capacity and personnel to expedite our processes.
Love it. Wonderful. That's fantastic. And I agree. It also comes back to that question of police reform, right? If we think of our ADAs as law enforcement, this is bringing back in the gatekeepers to undo some of the harm that is caused by intervention in these communities. Got a good question in the chat here that I'd love each of you to speak to. Can you speak about the work that has to be done regarding over sentencing and whether or not you see a role for that in clemency? Americans seem to have an unhealthy addiction to long sentences and do not seem to understand the difference between 1, 2, or 5 years or 20, 30 in life. Great question, big question. Secretary Flood, would you like to kick us off there?
It's pretty quick, and it's certainly something that I've considered quite a bit. Is I think the clemency should be baked into the sentencing process. So when I go before the sentencing phase, if I go before a judge, I should know if I do X, Y, and Z and complete my sentence that the court would be supportive of me receiving clemency. Oftentimes what we have is, and this is a real dynamic, especially given how long the process takes, you'll have a judge or a DA who may indicate that they would be supportive of that, but about time that person finishes their sentence, gets before our board, they're no longer on the bench. They're no longer in the DA's office. So you have someone that has no familiarity with the case or the intimate details of the case or the sentiments that may have been expressed during that proceeding and may oppose an application or may not weigh in. And that's where I talk about that insight coming from the DAs. That should be baked into the sentencing phase for those that are deserving. That way folks have a clear path. You talk about wanting to address recidivism rate, you have a clear path. It's not about, I have to wonder about if I stay on a straight and narrow, potentially I can get a pardon. I know without a shadow of a doubt that if I do X, Y, and Z, the outcome will be X.
There's a reward. There's a motivating factor.
What better incentive care than that?
Right. That's a fantastic point. I think also that could take a lot of forms, right? That could look like a judge saying, I support your clemency application if and when you do it. It could look like a judge, if we ever are able to push this through legislative wise, a judge saying this record is to live for 10 years post-sentence completion. It could take a lot of different forms that would give people hope and a reason to avoid recidivating, which I love that.
The only thing I'd add is that, we just did a poll that's not public with the Sentencing Project, and the country is not as progressive about some sentencing stuff as we thought, so like even I thought that people would be like, I thought that there'd be a consensus about 3 strikes laws. There's not. People are split, there are also people who are pushing for a 20-year cap, like that you cannot get sentenced longer than 20 years for any crime. And what's interesting is that when we ask people, they say yes. Like the majority is like 20-year cap, got it. And then when you ask people again, do you support a 20-year cap, and you list the crimes, people are like, not in a million years, right? So even ICE, people are split on ICE. Like if you're on Twitter, you think that everybody's against ICE. We poll people are not against ICE. I say this only to remind myself as an organizer that like we have a lot more narrative work to do, like helping people understand the story of like why this stuff is wrong, what is possible. And like, this is why, I think that we did it well with drugs. Like we sort of built this whole infrastructure to talk about drugs and how the drug war was bad. And we haven't replicated that yet. But like, if we're ever going to do anything about the sentencing or and the thing that I worry about with the sort of back end, right, so there are 2 ways we can do this. It's either to like get in the pipeline or to get out of the pipeline. There are a lot of people who put all their resources on the get out of the pipeline. Like that's what the Republicans do. So the Republicans are sort of like, we're not going to stop anybody from going to jail. But if you go to jail and your life got screwed up, we will help you get a job. And you're like, well, I mean, I guess, yes, that is like a good thing, but that's like not the big goal. The big goal is that people's lives aren't screwed up in the first place. And I don't think that we have like nailed the storytelling about that. And I think we have to. So when you think about places where like 30, 40% of jail admissions are technical violations of probation, it's like, we need to tell a better story because very few people think that makes sense. You know what I mean?
Reframing that narrative of, go ahead, Secretary.
That resonated with me. And it speaks to him, it speaks to his point about narrative building. So I just said what I said to your question. I live in Dauphin County. Dauphin County is by and large a Republican. There's more Republicans. Most of our DA has always been Republican. Most of the folks on the bench are Republican. So a good place for even to have this conversation would be, it's one thing for me to just say this generally, but I can start with my own county, right? I know it'll be a huge uphill battle, but to DeRay's point, that's where that narrative building will have to to come into play. So thank you, DeRay, for lighting a fire under my ass.
Fires are good, but yeah, that's a great point. That narrative of what's a criminal, who's a criminal, right? It's this shadowy figure, this person who doesn't deserve second chances. No, it's not. It's us. It's your neighbor. It's your cousin. It's you. Getting people to warm, so to speak, to that idea that people don't deserve to live with these records forever.
And like, how do we,
go
yeah,
ahead.
how do we start to dream big? You know, like there's one of the things that they're proposing, one of the things that they did in Oregon, they were thinking to expungement, right? And like the traditional way to do expungement is to like pass a law so that you can request to get your record expunged, right? Like that's like the most basic version of this. And what they did is that they were like, what if we just reclassify everything as a citation in one fell swoop? So like, you don't have to, you the person, you don't have to ask for anything. You don't have to do nothing. There's no paperwork. Everything just suddenly becomes a driver's, like a parking ticket. And you're like, that is how you do expungement. Like if you actually want to do expungement, that's expungement. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That is creative for the people who are worried about like, well, we won't know that so-and-so did. You can Google, you can like find the parking ticket somewhere, you know, like the record will still be there. That'll be our compromise to the people who want there to still be a record, but like, it won't mean anything really. And like, cool. You're like, that is so, I'm like, I was talking to a legislator, but I'm like, that's it. You dreamt bigger than even I had thought about. Like we have to start sort of thinking in those terms.
And if we want to push that bipartisan issue, it's cost effective, right? It's super, super cost effective. And there are people who are only going to buy in because of that, but that's fine as long as they buy in. Yeah, love that. Let's see. I think we're coming up on time here. I have, let's see, one more question in the chat here. Okay, I think we touched on this already. Just as we're coming up on closing, first, for those of you attending for CLE credit, our second keyword today is hope. I want to ask each of you to just kind of speak to this question of, you know, of hope, actually. Ending this in a better place than where we started and letting people walk away with a bit of optimism. Something that we hear, and speaking we, I mean, the organization I work with where we do, you know, criminal record expungement and pardon work, we hear a lot of our clients say that they feel like their sentence never ended, that they never got out, that they got out and everything was the same or worse than before they went in. And they feel like they have a life sentence for something that was grossly over sentenced in the first place, but now they feel like they're never going to get free of their records. You know, Akeem and Secretary Flood, speaking as people who have gone through this process, what would you share with those folks? DeRay, speaking as someone who has a lot of community contact, a lot of, you know, grounded work with folks who are dealing with these issues. What would each of you say to give people that kind of hope? Secretary, I'll start with you. I think we lost, oh, you're muted.
So for me, most people, unless they know me personally or grew up with me, or previously served time with me, most people just think that I'm, you know, even when I say I got a pardon, it's almost assumed like I had some like white collar crime or something. But, you know, I was really at one point at a crossroads where I was fully resigned to the fact that I was going to be a career criminal. I remember getting my before I even was sentenced on my second felony offense, I was hoping that I would be sentenced federally so I can meet a connection in a federal prison to come right back out and be able to do things on a larger scale in terms of trafficking narcotics. That was my mindset while literally in the bullpen before I was sentenced for my second sentence, and my second offense. So, and that was what, 2006. So you go from that being my mindset in 2006 to 2000, I would say maybe 2008, 2009, when it crystallized in my head that, hey, this is what I want to do. So it just goes to show, you know, I definitely didn't foresee this being, you know, where I am today, being a part of my narrative. But you know, it just goes to show, you know, hope, you know, hope does, you know, sustain you, you know, and certainly to Akeem's point, it's one thing to just have to step out on faith alone, but it's another to see examples of others that have gone through similar situations, and be able to rise above those. So, I would say, I usually say to other folks too, if I was able to surmount those obstacles and get to where I am, and by no means I don't believe I'm finished with my journey. Others can too, because I like to say, and I'll finish on this note, is that I'm not the exception to the rule. I'm just an example of the tens of thousands of men and women that are released every year that have more brilliant minds than I that can contribute if given an opportunity. So those will be my parting words.
Thank you, Secretary. Akeem?
So yes, thank you. Coming home, it's an adaptation process. People say re-entry, you have to adapt to whatever your atmosphere is at that time. So for me, saying hope, it's adjusting and adapting to whatever it is your circumstances are. And Secretary Flood mentioned something about the board highlighting is those supports. The supports that are around you, whether that is faith-based, family. I had it appear in the form of organizations as well, mentors who poured into me. So just having those is that hope that someday, right, you'll get the pardon, or like I said, the person that you evolve into in that process, you maneuver without, regardless of whether you have that pardon. That's what it has become for me, an internal reflection to now say, like, I don't actually need the pardon. I've forgiven myself. Clemency is about mercy and forgiveness. I've forgiven myself. I don't need the pardon, but for paperwork wise, it'd be great to have it. So yes, that hope is you can attain it. The accessibility is here, and they've made the application that much more simple, and the administration is favorable for pardons. Why not do it now?
Thank you, Akeem. Appreciate that. And Deray, would you like to close us out there?
Yeah, I just say I'm reminded that people built this, and because people built it, people can undo it. Like this is something that as an organizer, we say that these problems are present, not permanent, that they're here today. We can totally change it. And like that guides my work. I think that the thing that I am most reminded of is that the space generally spends way more time on the problems than the solutions. So we have like built a whole economy of uncovering how bad this stuff is. And I'm hoping that we start to do that same work around like just undoing it. That I think about the number of meetings I'm in with people where like Pay to Stay that I talked about, where like the legislator read it in Reader's Digest, where we are producing studies and polls and charts and op-eds to undo this stuff that people literally rolled out of bed and made up one day. And like, we have to start being aggressive about just normalizing that, like, we should do this. People shouldn't go to jail for us on the computer. Like, I'm with you about accountability, and I think that the more and more we do that, and I've seen it happen across the country, like that gives me hope. The thing that I'm also mindful of is that, these windows sort of open and close. So during the summer, during the protests, everybody wanted to be a champion on criminal justice. Now it's like, there's these conversations about murder rate is increasing. People are like nervous about, so we also have to be prepared to do the biggest, wildest asks when the window's open, but that requires us to do a lot of work when the window's closed, so we're ready. And like, I'm hopeful about it. I've never been more confident that we could win, and more sort of like anxious that people might not be ready. So I'm excited.
Well, ready or not, here we come, right? Well, thank you all to all of our panelists. You were all amazing. Thank you for sharing and being so forthright. I'm going to kick things over to Noah just to close us out with logistics, but everyone, thank you so much.
Yeah, hi, I'm Noah Schoenholtz. I'm co-chair of the Criminal Record Expungement Project with Casey Stewart. I want to quickly say thank you and then make a quick announcement about CLE credit. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Mr. Sims, Mr. McKesson, Secretary Flood, for spending time with us today and for just a really educational discussion. Thank you, Taylor, our wonderful moderator. Thank you, Victoria and Alicia at TPIC. Thank you, Casey Stewart, for all of your efforts planning this panel. And thank you to our audience for coming. We really appreciate it. And it's great to see a pretty strong audience. Finally, I'm just going to repeat, Taylor said the CLE password is HOPE. And if you are seeking CLE credits for today's event, Please remember to fill out your digital evaluation form and include the CLE codes announced throughout this event. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. The link was sent to you. If you didn't receive the email, the link is in the chat. All right. Thank you so much for everyone for coming. Thank you again to our panel and our moderator. I thought it was great. So thank you very much.